When the HOA president showed up at my doorstep, holding a clipboard like it was the Ten Commandments, I knew trouble had finally arrived. Not because of the clipboard, but because behind him sat a construction crew with orange vests and an excavator already chewing into the gravel that led to my driveway. Imagine sipping your morning coffee, still in pajamas, watching a stranger's bulldozer casually eat the only road connecting you to the outside world. No letter, no phone call, just diesel fumes and a smug man announcing, "This road is now HOA property. Congratulations, you're part of the Neighborhood Improvement Initiative." I almost spat out my coffee, but I held it in. Instead, I stared at him the way you stare at someone who insists the sky is green. He tapped his clipboard like it was a weapon, declaring that my private access lane had been absorbed into HOA jurisdiction. His reasoning? It improves community value. Mine? That road was on my deed. My family had paid for it. But logic rarely survives a head-on collision with entitlement. I told him calmly, "You made a very expensive mistake." He chuckled, like I just threatened him with a water balloon. That was the morning I realized these people weren't misinformed. They were on a power trip. A few days earlier, they tried to convince me to join the HOA voluntarily. I declined, politely, maybe too politely. I didn't realize declining was like stepping on the queen bee's stinger. They'd smiled, nodded, and then plotted. And this was the result. My road, gone without a whisper of consent. Within hours, I was essentially landlocked. Trucks tore up gravel, laid down fresh asphalt, and installed little white HOA-approved signs announcing community pathway, HOA jurisdiction. The arrogance was breathtaking. One neighbor waved at me as if this were a block party, not an illegal seizure of property. Another muttered something about finally raising standards around here, which made me laugh because a shed leaned harder than a drunk sailor. But the real showstopper came later that afternoon. I found my mailbox, my actual bolted-down, federally protected mailbox, had been replaced with a shiny HOA-issued one. My old box sat in the ditch, didn't like it had lost a bar fight. Inside the new box was a glossy pamphlet welcoming me to the family. The audacity almost deserved applause. Almost. That night, I didn't rant. I didn't scream. I just poured myself a drink and opened my laptop. If they wanted to play legal chess, fine. But I've always preferred checkmate by surprise. I spent hours combing through county plat maps, property lines, easement laws. The deeper I dug, the more delicious it became. Turns out, the HOA hadn't just taken my road illegally. They created a logistical nightmare for themselves. By absorbing it, they made it part of their shared community property, which meant legally they now owed maintenance, liability, and, this was the kicker, parking enforcement. Parking, the HOA's favorite weapon and my soon-to-be Trojan horse. See, my road connected not just to my driveway, but also opened up into a wide gravel shoulder I'd use for deliveries. With their little land grab, the HOA had essentially turned that shoulder into common parking space. The same space they'd just declared under their control. My mind started spinning with possibilities. The very next day, the HOA president strutted back, expecting me to sign some paperwork. Instead, I thanked him, sincerely, told him how grateful I was for all the improvements. His smugness inflated to cartoonish levels, and he walked away believing he'd won. What he didn't know was that I'd already started making calls. Friends, coworkers, old classmates. I invited everyone with a beater car or junker they didn't mind parking long-term. Free storage, I told them, no questions asked. Within 48 hours, my old gravel shoulder transformed into a used car lot straight out of a bargain basement commercial. Every car was perfectly legal, registered, insured, parked neatly within the lines. And every single one of them was now the HOA's problem. Their shiny new community pathway looked like a scrapyard. Neighbors complained to the board, but the board had no choice but to enforce their own rules. No overnight bans, no arbitrary tickets. They had declared it common property, and common property meant equal access. By the end of the week, HOA meetings were chaos. People shouted about eyesores, about dropping property values, about the sudden influx of outsiders. The president tried to pin it on me, but I just shrugged and pointed at their own pamphlet. Shared responsibility. The more they pushed, the more cars appeared. Some broke down and never moved again. Some leaked oil like open wounds. A few even had for sale signs slapped on them. And through it all, I stayed calm, sipping coffee from my porch, watching the HOA unravel. What started as a power move had become their biggest mistake. But I wasn't done, because while they panicked about parking, I was already setting up the next phase. If they thought a field of junkers was bad, they hadn't yet considered what happens when those cars suddenly vanish. The encore arrived the night the cars disappeared. One moment the HOA had a scrapyard choking their precious new community pathway, and by sunrise, it was spotless, eerily spotless. Imagine walking outside to find 20 rusted beaters gone like they'd been abducted by aliens with a taste for dented Toyotas. The neighbors gawked. The president stormed up my porch, waving his clipboard like it could summon the missing vehicles back into existence. "Where did they go?" he barked. I smiled. "What cars?" He sputtered. His little entourage of board members muttered theories, tow trucks, conspiracies, maybe even theft. They couldn't wrap their heads around it because they thought in terms of rules and penalties. I thought in terms of leverage. Truth was, the cars weren't stolen. They'd been relocated, parked legally on public streets surrounding the HOA's borders, each one tagged with a polite note. Courtesy of HOA overflow parking. Contact President. Insert his full name for details. Neighbors from outside the HOA called the county. Soon enough, cops and code enforcement officers were knocking on the board's doors, asking why cars from their jurisdiction were suddenly clogging every nearby road. The president tried to deny involvement, but the notes made him the star of the show. His phone blew up. His inbox drowned. For once, his smug expression cracked. The best part? I didn't lift a finger beyond arranging transport. Friends with trailers, tow licenses, and side hustles helped me shuffle the cars in the dead of night. Nobody broke a single law. Every vehicle was registered, every move documented, every receipt tucked safely in my drawer. The HOA had given me common property, and I'd simply given it back, redistributed like some sarcastic Robin Hood of parking. But here's the twist that caught even me off guard. The backlash didn't just come from annoyed outsiders. It came from within. The HOA had been crowing about how absorbing my road would raise property values. Instead, local news picked up the story. They didn't use my name, but they plastered his. HOA president accused of dumping cars on public streets. The headline alone was enough to tank his reputation faster than a lead balloon. Suddenly, board meetings turned into gladiator arenas. Homeowners accused the president of embarrassing the neighborhood. Realtors whispered about collapsing home values. Even his allies on the board began jumping ship. Watching it unfold was like watching a snake eat its own tail. Of course, they suspected me. He marched up again, demanding I confess. I didn't deny or confirm. I just asked, "You sure you want this conversation recorded?" I pointed at his phone, which he always used to document infractions. He actually looked scared. For once, the man realized silence could bury him deeper than any accusation. But here's where the real fun started. I didn't want them just humiliated. I wanted them accountable. I slipped copies of the county plat map into a few mailboxes, specifically the ones belonging to the loudest critics of the board. Within hours, homeowners learned the president had seized private land illegally. They were furious, not because they cared about me, but because they realized if it could happen to me, it could happen to them. That week, 3 families filed complaints. Lawsuits buzzed like hornets in the air. The HOA board scrambled for cover, insisting the president acted independently. He insisted it was unanimous. Either way, cracks widened into chasms. And yet, as much as I enjoyed the implosion, I knew HOAs are like hydras. Cut off one head, and another grows back. They could replace him with someone equally smug. They could double down, try to bury me in fees or bylaws. So I needed something more permanent. A way to not just fight back, but end their obsession with my property once and for all. That's when I discovered the hidden clause. Buried deep in the HOA's own governing documents, a line about expansion of community boundaries required a 2/3 majority vote of all members. No majority had voted to absorb my road. No vote had been held at all. which meant their entire stunt wasn't just illegal. It nullified their authority. The road was still mine, legally, on paper, in every way that mattered. So why didn't I march into court right then and there? Because patience tastes sweeter. I let them twist. I let them scramble, lash out, accuse one another. The longer they dragged it out, the worse they looked. Every panicked move, every poorly written email, every angry voicemail left a trail I quietly archived. My folder grew fat with evidence, and my smile grew sharper. The president, meanwhile, was unraveling. He started driving past my house late at night, slowing down like a prowler. His car idled at the end of my driveway more than once. Neighbors noticed. Whispers spread. Suddenly, the man who wanted to control everything looked less like a leader and more like a liability. The night before the board's emergency vote to try and re-seize my road properly, he parked outside again. This time I stepped onto my porch with a flashlight, shone it right into his windshield, and raised my glass in a toast. He peeled out like a teenager caught sneaking beer. The board thought they were about to fix everything with their vote. What they didn't know was that I'd already lined up something far more explosive than junk cars or relocated beaters. I was about to make them choke on their own bylaws. The emergency vote was held in the clubhouse, a beige building that smelled faintly of stale coffee and chlorine from the community pool next door. I didn't even need to attend. Half the neighborhood showed up, not because they loved the process, but because scandal had a magnetic pull. The president strutted in late, red-faced and sweating, trying to command the room with his usual clipboard theatrics. But by then, everyone had read the plat map copies I'd quietly distributed. Everyone knew the seizure of my road had been done without consent, without vote, without legality. The air buzzed with tension. They still tried, of course. Motions were shouted. Voices overlapped. Someone banged a gavel like it was a medieval drum. The president declared that tonight's vote would ratify the previous action. A woman in the back stood and asked why they were voting on something already declared illegal by the county clerk. He snapped at her to sit down. She didn't. She demanded to see the minutes from the original meeting where the road was supposedly approved. His silence was an answer louder than any gavel. From my porch, I could practically hear the implosion echo across the subdivision. Within an hour, text messages flooded my phone. Neighbors updated me in real time like sports commentators. One message read, "He just called someone a liar and stormed out." Another, "2 board members resigned on the spot." A third simply said, "You've broken him." But here's the twist that took it from petty drama to high-stakes chaos. The county itself got involved. I hadn't even filed my lawsuit yet, but word of the road grab and the public meltdown reached the zoning office. They sent inspectors to review community easements. The HOA, which prided itself on being the neighborhood's watchdog, suddenly had watchdogs of its own. Inspectors noted not just the illegal seizure of my road, but other irregularities, drainage violations, unpermitted fences, even a playground structure installed without compliance. The HOA's spotless facade cracked wide open. The president's grip on power loosened further. But he wasn't finished. He doubled down. He blamed me in front of the entire community, accusing me of orchestrating the inspectors, the resignations, the chaos. He pointed at my house during a meeting and shouted, "That man is sabotaging us." The irony was delicious. He'd forgotten the first rule of leadership. Never admit who your enemy is unless you can actually beat them. By naming me, he turned me into a lightning rod. Every homeowner who hated him suddenly saw me as the alternative. Not because I asked to be, but because I was the only one standing tall while he flailed. And then came the night raid. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of gravel crunching. Through the blinds, I saw figures moving with flashlights near the road. At first, I thought vandals. But when I stepped quietly onto the porch, I saw the truth. HOA loyalists. 3 of them, led by the president himself, hauling posts and concrete bags from the back of a truck. They were trying to erect a barrier across my driveway. A gate. Their version of a final stand. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just pulled out my phone, turned on the camera, and recorded. Their heads snapped up, deer in headlights. The president tried to bluff. "This is authorized construction." I asked, Authorized by who? The Midnight Committee. His own accomplices looked at each other, realizing they'd been dragged into felony-level trespassing. The video was short, sharp, and devastating. The next morning, I sent it directly to the zoning office. By lunch, the county sheriff had paid a visit. The barrier was dismantled before the concrete could even set. The president's truck was impounded for improper transport of construction materials without permit. He wasn't arrested, but the humiliation was worse. The entire neighborhood watched him stand beside his idling truck while deputies wrote citations. The man who had once wielded clipboards now stood cuffed by paperwork of a different kind. But here's the escalation no one saw coming. Not even me. Insurance companies. The HOA carried liability insurance. Once the county flagged their illegal actions, the insurer launched its own review. Suddenly, every stupid stunt the board had pulled, every fence, every playground, every road seizure, was under the microscope. Homeowners received letters warning of potential premium spikes. Nothing turns a mob faster than money, and premiums rising meant the president's few remaining allies evaporated overnight. And yet, the man refused to resign. He doubled down again, claiming I was conspiring with the county, with the media, maybe even with the federal government. His paranoia became public spectacle. At one meeting, he demanded that every homeowner swear loyalty to the board. They laughed at him, literally laughed, right in his face. Watching him unravel from my porch felt like watching a poorly written play collapse under its own weight. But I wasn't celebrating yet, because even cornered animals lash out, and I knew he still had one move left. He'd already shown me he wasn't afraid to cross lines, literally, onto my property in the middle of the night. The question wasn't if he'd escalate again. It was how. The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived. Not from the HOA, but from their attorney. A lawsuit. They were suing me for defamation, community disruption, and malicious interference. It was laughable, but lawsuits aren't about truth. They're about time, money, pressure. He thought he could drown me in paperwork. What he didn't realize was that I'd been waiting for this moment. My evidence folder was thicker than a phone book. Every video, every map, every note from the county was already lined up. If he wanted a war in court, I was more than ready to give him one. And this time, it wouldn't just cost him pride. It would cost him everything. The lawsuit arrived in a thick envelope, heavy enough to feel like a threat just sitting on my kitchen table. I skimmed the accusations with a dry chuckle. Defamation, interference, disruption of community harmony. The words were so grand, they sounded like a Shakespearean tragedy, except instead of kings and castles, we were arguing over an access road and a pack of junk cars. Still, I knew better than to underestimate paperwork. Lawsuits are designed to bleed you slowly. Money, patience, reputation. So I played it the same way I always had. Calm, precise, deliberate. I hired a lawyer, the kind who loves paperwork the way chefs love knives. While the HOA president thought he was dragging me into his arena, he'd actually stepped into mine. Because unlike him, I didn't need to embellish or inflate. I had receipts, dozens of them. The midnight raid video. The county inspector's notes, the insurance company's warnings, every smug voicemail he'd left demanding compliance. It wasn't just evidence. It was a timeline of his own undoing. The first pretrial hearing was packed. Half the neighborhood turned out, some out of loyalty, most out of morbid curiosity. The president strutted into court with his attorney, still clinging to a shred of authority, though the sweat on his collar betrayed him. I sat there with my folder and my lawyer, calm as a man at a chessboard. When the judge asked for opening remarks, his attorney launched into a tirade about my malicious intent to sabotage the HOA. My lawyer responded by quietly handing the judge a flash drive with a midnight gate-building video queued up. 30 seconds in, the entire courtroom watched the president fumble with a post-hole digger while whispering, "Hurry before he notices." The silence afterward was the kind that breaks bones. The judge leaned back, unimpressed. "And this is the plaintiff?" he asked, glancing at the president. That single remark carried more weight than any argument we could have made. The case wasn't dismissed yet, but the balance had shifted. His credibility, already cracked, fractured further. But here's the twist that made the courtroom gasp. The county had filed its own countersuit. Parallel to our little drama, the zoning office and insurance company had joined forces, accusing the HOA of negligence and unlawful land seizure. What had started as him trying to crush me now threatened to crush the entire board. Premium hikes, fines, restitution. It was a tidal wave, and his lawsuit had dragged it all into the open. You could see the panic spread across the faces of the other board members sitting behind him. One woman started whispering frantically to another, probably realizing she'd signed off on documents now considered fraudulent. The president, though, doubled down. He ranted in court, shouting about conspiracies, about outsiders meddling in community affairs. The judge banged the gavel and warned him once more, but the damage was done. He wasn't just losing, he was unraveling publicly. And then came the twist I hadn't planned, but couldn't have scripted better. A homeowner stood up mid-hearing. He raised his hand, voice shaking, and declared he wanted to testify against the president. The judge allowed it. The man explained how the board had pressured him into compliance with threats of fines, how they'd manipulated votes, how they'd bullied residents for years. One by one, others followed. Voices from the back of the courtroom chimed in, piling story after story onto the growing mountain of grievances. My lawyer didn't even need to ask questions. The president's own neighbors buried him. By the end of the day, his lawsuit looked like a desperate smokescreen. The judge ordered mediation, but it was clear where things were headed. The HOA wasn't just fractured, it was on the verge of collapse. Insurance companies don't forgive fraud. Counties don't overlook illegal land grabs. And neighbors don't forget humiliation. That night, I walked home through the neighborhood, and people actually stopped me to talk. Folks who'd never waved before nodded in quiet solidarity. Some thanked me. Others just muttered about selling before things got worse. I didn't bask in it. I wasn't their hero. I was just the guy who refused to roll over. The president, though, wasn't finished. He showed up again, this time not with clipboards or lawyers, but with a half-drunk scowl and a warning. He cornered me outside my driveway, muttering about how I'd regret this and how he had friends in high places. I asked if those friends carried post-hole diggers too. He didn't laugh. He just glared, then stumbled back into his car. His threats weren't scary anymore. They were pathetic. But here's the escalation that even I didn't anticipate. Whispers of a recall. Neighbors were drafting petitions to dissolve the entire HOA. Not just remove him. Not just reshuffle the board. Erase it. Dismantle the whole power structure that had lorded over them for years. It was more than I'd planned. More than I'd dared hope for. Of course, recalls are messy. They bring out fear, anger, desperation. And desperate men do reckless things. I knew the president wouldn't go quietly. If his midnight stunt was any clue, he'd rather burn down the clubhouse than hand over the gavel. And as the recall effort gained steam, I prepared for his final act. Because men like him don't fade out, they implode. The only question was how spectacularly it would happen, and how ready I'd be when the fire started. The recall meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where the sun is too bright for the ugliness about to unfold. By then, the subdivision had split into camps. Half the neighborhood wanted blood, the president's resignation, the board's dismantling, maybe even restitution. The other half clung to the idea of order, even if it came from a tyrant with a clipboard. Everyone knew it would be loud, maybe messy. No one knew just how far the president would go. I showed up early, not to participate, but to observe. The clubhouse parking lot was packed, cars jammed at odd angles, people arguing before they even reached the door. Inside, folding chairs formed crooked rows, voices rose and fell like surf. The recall petition had already gathered enough signatures. This meeting was supposed to be procedural, a vote to finalize what was already inevitable. The president, however, had other plans. He stormed in late again, but this time without the clipboard. Instead, he carried a folder bulging with papers. His tie was crooked, his eyes bloodshot. When he took the podium, the room fell silent. Not out of respect, but anticipation, like watching a fuse burn. He started with a speech about betrayal, how neighbors had turned on him, how outsiders were poisoning the community, how I was the ringleader of some grand conspiracy. He waved the folder like a weapon, declaring he had evidence against me. He pulled out printed screenshots of my supposed plots, text messages, emails, even maps he claimed proved I'd been orchestrating everything. They were laughably fake, cobbled together with fonts that didn't match, dates that contradicted themselves. One even had a timestamp in the future. The crowd didn't buy it. Murmurs turned to snickers, then to outright laughter. The louder they laughed, the more he shouted, veins bulging, spittle flying. He screamed about loyalty, about discipline, about how he was the only one standing between order and chaos. His words didn't land like commands anymore. They landed like tantrums. Then came the final twist. In a last-ditch effort to prove his authority, he reached into the folder and pulled out a stack of violation notices, fines he had pre-written against half the neighborhood. He started reading names, announcing penalties for everything from lawn height to unauthorized holiday decorations. He was essentially declaring war on his own residents in real time. That was the breaking point. One of the board's remaining members, a mild-mannered retiree who had tolerated far too much, stood up and said, "That's enough." He walked to the podium, pried the papers out of the president's hands, and tore them in half. The room erupted. People shouted, some cheered, some booed, and in the chaos, someone shouted the words that ended it all. "We vote now." The vote was swift, chaotic, and decisive. Two-thirds majority wasn't even close. The HOA board was dissolved on the spot. No more bylaws. No more fines. No more president. Just a stunned man standing at the front of the room, realizing his power had evaporated in the span of 15 minutes. But he didn't leave gracefully. He pounded the podium, shouting about lawsuits and appeals. He swore the county would regret interfering, that the insurance company would back him, that the courts would vindicate him. His voice cracked under the weight of desperation. And then, in the ultimate act of absurdity, he tried to declare the vote invalid, waving his hands like a preacher denying the existence of gravity. Security was called. Yes, actual security for a suburban recall meeting. 2 guards escorted him out as he screamed about conspiracies and traitors. He struggled, flailed, shouted promises of revenge, but the sight of him being walked past the rows of folding chairs was the final nail. No one feared him anymore. They pitied him. Afterward, people spilled into the parking lot, buzzing like a crowd, leaving a stadium after an upset game. Some were jubilant. Some were exhausted. A few were angry, muttering about what came next without an HOA. I just leaned against my car, watching it all play out. One neighbor approached me, thanked me for fighting the good fight. I told him I hadn't fought for them. I fought for my road. The rest was collateral damage. That night, I walked the freshly reclaimed gravel path that led to my driveway. The county had already confirmed the deed was clear. The road was mine again, free of their signs, their paint, their arrogance. The silence felt different now. Less like isolation, more like peace. As for the president, word spread fast. He tried filing appeals, but without the board behind him, he was just another homeowner with too much time and too little sense. The insurance company dropped coverage on his personal property after reviewing his antics. The county fined him personally for unpermitted construction. Rumor had it he was selling his house, unable to live under the weight of his own humiliation. I never gloated, not out loud, but sometimes, sipping coffee on my porch, I thought about that first morning, him standing with his clipboard excavator behind him, declaring my road absorbed. And I laughed, because in the end, he hadn't absorbed anything. He drowned in his own arrogance. The neighborhood moved on. Some were relieved, some wary, some nostalgic for the order the HOA once provided. But everyone agreed on one thing. No one wanted to see another clipboard wielded like a crown again. And as for me, I had my road back. My quiet, stubborn little strip of gravel that started it all. It wasn't just a road. It was a reminder that entitlement collapses under its own weight, that arrogance can pave itself straight into ruin, and that sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting or suing or fighting. It's calmly holding your ground until the other side implodes. So when people ask me how I managed to beat an entire HOA, I just smile and say, I didn't. They beat themselves. I just made sure everyone was watching.